Audra Sterne was handed to the Earl of Dunmere in July for £1,100. The precise figure her cousin Bryce had calculated would clear his card debt without leaving a visible remainder. She arrived at Dunmere Hall on a Tuesday afternoon in a hired coach, wearing a pale blue travelling dress and white gloves that ran from her fingertips to the crook of her elbow, buttoned at the wrist with 9 small pearl buttons. The July heat pressed flat across the lawn. Every servant in the front drive noticed the gloves. None of them said anything. She stepped down without waiting for the footman. Not out of defiance. Standing in the gravel, reaching back into the carriage for her own bag, would have been awkward for everyone, and she had no interest in adding to anyone's awkwardness. She handed the bag over when it was offered, folded her hands together at the front of her skirt, and waited in the heat with the composed stillness of a woman who had spent 3 years learning what composed stillness costs. She was 24 years old. She was the new Countess of Dunmere, or would be by Thursday. She had not chosen to be. The truth of how she had come to be standing in this gravel drive on this particular Tuesday was a straightforward story, and she had told it to herself often enough that it no longer hurt the way it had the first week. Her father, Dr. Malcolm Sterne, had kept a medical practice in Carlwick for 19 years and had built something small and real out of it, a house, a modest income, a body of recorded work that he was quietly proud of. When he died in March of the previous year, of a chest fever that moved faster than any of his remedies could follow, he left everything to Audra. That was what his will said. That was what the original document said. What Bryce had said, once the lawyers were in the room and the papers were on the table, was different. She had no way to prove the difference. The documents were in order. The signatures matched, or matched well enough that a young woman with no legal standing and no money for a solicitor of her own had no way to argue otherwise. Bryce had been patient. He had been working on the papers for months before her father died, long enough to do it carefully, long enough to make it look like an estate naturally settled upon the nearest male relative, as estates naturally did. He had kept her in the house for 14 months after that, long enough for it to stop looking like what it was. Then April came, and a letter arrived from a firm in London, and Bryce sat down across from her in her father's front parlour and explained, in the calm voice he used for things that were not open to discussion, that she was to be married to an Earl in the northern counties by the end of summer. He had called it a fortunate arrangement. He had said a physician's daughter with her circumstances ought to be grateful. He had not mentioned the £1,100. What was she hiding beneath those gloves? That question had followed her from Carlwick to Dunmere. She could feel it in the way the housekeeper's eyes moved, in the pause before the footman looked away, in the particular studied blankness of Fern. The maid assigned to her on arrival, who had the intelligent face of a woman trained to notice everything and the discipline not to show it. The answer was a burn, 2 of them running from her left wrist to the inside of her elbow in pale, uneven ridges that had healed badly because she had not been able to go to a physician about them, for reasons that required no explanation to anyone who understood what Bryce was. He had not been impulsive, he had not been drunk, he had been deliberate, as he was in everything, and the incident in the kitchen had been arranged to look like an accident, and she had let it look like an accident because she was 22 and alone, and the man who had done it controlled the roof above her head. She had started wearing the gloves the month after it happened. She had not stopped. Reed Caxton, Earl of Dunmere, arrived at his own entrance hall 40 minutes after Audra did. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps. She heard the change in the room. Fern, who'd been standing quietly near the window, straightened without being told. Hawkins, the steward, turned to face the door with the specific posture of a man preparing to receive someone whose opinion of his work mattered to him. Even the air seemed to rearrange itself slightly, the way it does when the person who owns a room walks into it. Then he came through the door. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver early at the temples, still in riding clothes dusty from the road. He moved with the economy of someone who did not spend motion unnecessarily, and he had the look of a man who had been outdoors all day and found it more honest than any room. His eyes, when they crossed the hall and found her, were dark, the kind of dark that holds its own counsel. He walked toward her, and she did not step forward. Her body had learned, in the years since her father died, that moving toward an approaching man was a calculation that required advance information. "Miss Sterne," his voice was low and measured, "I apologize for the delay. I wasn't informed of your arrival time until this afternoon." "It's no trouble, my lord," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone attempting an accurate reading of something unfamiliar. Then he looked at Hawkins, gave the necessary instructions. Solicitor Thursday, ceremony Friday, anything she required through Mrs. Crane, and was already turning when she spoke. "My lord." He turned back. Nothing moved in his face. "My father kept medical records for 19 years, she said. "I transcribed them with him every evening from the time I was 12. I understand your estate physician retired last spring and hasn't been replaced." She kept her voice level and her hands still. "I'd like to review the existing prescription records before I meet with your solicitor. I want to understand what I'm entering." The silence that followed had weight, not hostile, more like the silence of a man performing a rapid and invisible recalculation. "I'll arrange it with Hawkins," he said after a beat that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. "Tomorrow morning." He left. She stood still until she was certain she was composed, then followed Fern upstairs, and in her room with the door closed, she pressed her back against the wall and breathed slowly until her hands stopped shaking. The Earl's sister, Constance Caxton, arrived on Friday morning without being invited. She came the way she always came, which was as though she had never needed an invitation in her life. She was 31, unmarried by her own design, with the posture of a woman to whom the concept of making herself smaller had simply never applied. She found Audra in the library before breakfast and sat down across from her and looked at the gloves. "I want to be honest with you," Constance said. Her voice was pleasant, the pleasantness of a woman who understood that a pleasant delivery was harder to argue against than an open attack. "My brother agreed to this arrangement through solicitors at a distance, without meeting you first. I'm aware of the terms." "Then we have the same information," Audra said without looking up from her page. "What I want you to understand." Constance picked up a small painted box from the side table, the one positioned with obvious care, and moved it an inch from where it had been, "is that Reed has managed this estate and this household without anyone in the position you're about to occupy for 4 years. I have been here. I understand this house." She set the box down. "Stay quiet, stay out of his affairs, and we'll have no difficulty. Make yourself ambitious, and I'll make sure every family in this county knows exactly what Bryce Sterne sold, and why." Audra looked up. "Thank you for the warning," she said. Constance's eyes went cooler. She had expected fear, or the elaborate deference that signals a woman who knows she's already lost. She had not expected that particular tone, which was not challenge, but was absolutely not submission either. She left. After she was gone, Audra crossed the room and moved the painted box back to its original position and went back to her page. In the first 3 weeks at Dunmere, Audra learned the architecture of her new situation through the prescription records. The estate physician, Dr. Wick, had retired in April after 30 years of service, and his records were meticulous in the way of long tenure, thorough, consistent, and, in 3 specific places, wrong. The dosage entries for a common fever remedy had been altered in the most recent volume, not dramatically, subtly enough that a quick review would miss it. But she was not reviewing. Her father had believed that a medical record was a moral document, and she had absorbed that belief through years of evening work at his desk. She brought it to Hawkins first. He went very still when he saw the entry. "This has been carried from June," he said quietly. "Across 4 months. It's not fraud, it's a transcription error from a formula change. But it's the kind of error that could cause serious harm if the remedy were prepared from the current record." She paused. "I'd like to write to the supplier today." Hawkins looked at her with an expression she took a moment to identify. Respect, measured, professional, the kind extended between people who understand the same thing about the same kind of work. "I'll pull the delivery records this afternoon, my lady." She was addressed as my lady for the first time in a way that was not practiced courtesy. The difference was small and absolutely real. The Earl appeared in the library doorway 20 minutes later. He had clearly come for something else and found her instead. He looked at the open records on the table, then at her. "Hawkins tells me you found an error in Wick's records. A dosage discrepancy, carried across 4 months. I've marked the entries." She kept her voice matter-of-fact. Wick would have been watching for intentional falsification. "This isn't that. It's a supplier update that wasn't transcribed forward. Different problem entirely." He came fully into the room and stood at the corner of the table and looked at the records for a long moment. Then, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, the ghost of one, involuntary and immediately controlled. She saw it. She filed it away and showed nothing. That evening at dinner, he asked about her father's record system. She told him about the cross-referencing between patient files and remedy books, the way it functioned as a narrative of treatment across years. He listened. He asked a question. The question led to another. They talked genuinely for the first time. 13 minutes, she counted without meaning to. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and felt something small and careful and warm move in her chest. A coal banked low for a long time, only now being given air. She did not name it. Naming it would require trusting it, and she was not ready for that. Bryce arrived on a Wednesday in the 3rd week. She heard his voice in the entrance hall and recognized the particular register he used when performing for an audience he considered worth performing for. She went to the library and waited. The Earl found her there an hour later. He came in and closed the door behind him and set a folder on the table between them. "Your cousin has represented to my solicitors that the property transfer from your father's estate was straightforward, that Dr. Sterne revised his will in the final months." "That is not true," Audra said. "I know." He looked at her directly. "My solicitor found an irregularity in the attestation signatures 3 weeks ago. He's been investigating quietly since then." The room held a particular stillness. She had not known this. She had believed herself to be alone in knowing, and she had been carrying that alone for 14 months, and the revelation that someone had already been looking, before she said a word, moved through her chest in a way she could not immediately name. "The gloves," the Earl said, quietly. The word cost him something. She could hear it. She looked at him. His face was very still, and his hands resting on the table were not entirely steady. "When you arrived," he said, wearing long gloves in July, "I knew something was wrong. I chose not to ask." He stopped. "I chose not to ask because I didn't know what the answer would require of me." His jaw tightened. "I'm asking now." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she made the decision, the one that felt like stepping off the edge of something she'd been standing at the top of for a very long time, and she spoke. "It was the kitchen fire," she said. "Arranged to look like an accident, the summer after my father died." Her voice stayed level. She was proud of that. Bryce had made it clear by then that any resistance on my part would be met with something he had more control over. The burns healed badly because I couldn't go to a physician about them safely. She looked at her left hand. "I started wearing the gloves the month after. I wore them here because I didn't know yet whether this was a place where it was necessary." The silence afterward was very large. The Earl stood. He walked to the window and stood there for a long moment with his back to her. When he turned, his face had the look of a man who has made a decision and will not waste time doubting it. "I have a journal," Audra said. "My father's." He recorded everything. Every patient, every treatment, every visit, including mine. She looked at the folder between them. He wrote down what he saw when he treated my arms in his own hand, in the same journal that documents 19 years of his practice. She let that stay between them for a moment. "I believe it constitutes evidence." He was still then. "We need that journal." She reached into the pocket of her dress and set it on the table. She had been carrying it with her since July. The autumn gathering at Dunmere Hall was the largest social event the county had seen in several years. 40 guests, long tables in the great hall, fires in every grate, candlelight visible from the drive before the carriages reached the door. Audra received each guest with Mrs. Crane at her shoulder and used every name correctly. She had spent a week learning them. The senior families in the county watched her with the attention they reserved for quantities not yet determined, and she gave them nothing to criticize. Constance arrived at 7:10. She came without being specifically invited, as she always did, and took her usual chair at the great table, with the composure of a woman who has never once sat somewhere she was not supposed to. The first course passed without incident. The second passed the same way. Audra acted as hostess with the skills she had been building since she was 16, when she ran her father's parish dinners for visiting colleagues and local dignitaries. She bridged silences, introduced subjects, drew out the quieter guests. She was aware every moment of Constance watching her from across the table. It happened during the third course. Constance stood, a natural, unremarked motion, the kind of thing a person does when reaching past someone. She moved behind the chairs on Audra's side of the table with the unhurried precision of a woman who has planned her route. Her hands came down to Audra's left arm. In one smooth pull, she had the glove off at the wrist. The room went silent. 40 guests, candlelight, the pale, ridged burn scars running from Audra's wrist to the inside of her elbow fully visible. Not one chair scraped, not one glass rang. Lady Harfield, 63 years old, who had survived 2 widowhoods and knew exactly where to put her eyes when a room required it, looked once and then fixed her gaze on the table in front of her with the expression of a woman choosing deliberately. Constance stood with the glove in her hand. She had expected something she could mock, a minor scar, a small ordinary imperfection she could make large enough to be useful. She had not calculated for this. The triumph she had walked to this chair to collect had lasted less than 2 seconds, and what replaced it was something she could not name quickly enough to control, the arrested understanding that she had done something she could not undo in front of 40 witnesses, to the woman who was already being addressed as my lady by the staff. Audra sat perfectly still. She was composed in the way her father had been composed at the bedside of the dying, from the inside out, because the alternative had never been available to her, and she had stopped waiting for it. The Earl rose. He rose the way he moved through rooms, without gesture, without theatre, simply rising to his full height with the absolute stillness of a man who does not need to perform authority because it is already there. He looked at Audra's arm for one moment. Something moved through his face that he did not attempt to manage. Then he removed his evening coat. He walked the length of the table in silence, past 40 people who were so still they might have been part of the room. He stopped behind Audra's chair and laid the coat across her arm with the deliberate care of someone handling something that matters, smoothing the lapels with both hands. Then he turned and looked at his sister. The room held its breath. "Leave Dunmere tonight," he said. Constance's jaw tightened. "Read." "Tonight." Same register, no louder, more final, the kind of words that close a door rather than slam it. She had been looking for the version of her brother she knew, the one who always eventually made room for her, who had always found a way to step back from the edge. That version was not present in this room. Constance set the glove on the table. Her hands were not steady. She walked to the door and through it, and her footsteps faded down the corridor, and then there was only the sound of 40 people remembering how to breathe. Audra sat in his coat with her hands folded in her lap. She was composed. She was the most composed person in the room, and she would feel the full weight of this later, alone, with the door locked and no witnesses, but not yet. Not here. Lady Harfield set down her fork and looked directly at Audra. "I believe the venison is excellent, my lady," she said, in a voice that carried the full authority of someone who has been reading rooms for 6 decades and knows exactly what one needs. The dinner resumed. 20 minutes later, Hawkins appeared in the doorway and caught the Earl's eye. One small nod. The Earl excused himself for 4 minutes. When he returned, a folder was under his arm. "Before the final course," he said, addressing the table with the ease of a man who has been preparing for this moment for weeks, "there's a matter I believe warrants this company's attention." He opened the folder. He spoke clearly and without embellishment. Bryce Sterne, the forged attestation signatures on Dr. Malcolm Sterne's estate documents, The chain of evidence now assembled the figure, the full value of property transferred under false papers. He named the firms that had verified it. He named the 2 witnesses who had given statements. Then he looked at Audra, and what was in his face was direct and warm and deliberate, in front of 40 people who were all watching him do it. My wife identified the pattern of falsification from the original documents 3 weeks ago, he said. She also retained her father's medical journal. 19 years of Dr. Sterne's recorded practice in his own hand, which documents treatment of injuries sustained by his daughter in the summer after his death. He held her gaze for a moment. Both pieces of evidence have been delivered to the county magistrate. Audra took the second document from the folder. She read clearly. She named dates and figures, and the specific discrepancies between what the forged documents stated and what her father's originals showed. She cited the journal entries, her father's careful physician's handwriting recording what he had seen and treated, in the same volume that documented 19 years of other people's fevers and broken bones and difficult births. She read without trembling, because her father had taught her that a factual record should be read as one, without embellishment and without apology. She read for 5 minutes. When she finished, the table was completely silent. Lady Harfield looked at her steadily. "Your father taught you to read records," she said. "He taught me to look for the place where the number doesn't match the story it's supposed to tell," Audra said. "He said a lie in a ledger never announces itself. You have to go looking." The old woman nodded once slowly, the nod of someone entering a final verdict. "He would have been proud of you," she said. Bryce Sterne was located in Carlwick the following morning and taken into custody. The county magistrate, who had been seated in the east sitting room for the first hour of the dinner, having been given copies of the documents in advance, confirmed the charge. The hearing was set for spring. The penalty, given the nature of the forged testamentary documents, was expected to be transportation. Audra sat in the Earl's coat for the remainder of the dinner, and afterwards she went upstairs and locked her door, and sat on the edge of the bed, and let herself feel the full weight of everything at once. The relief came out as shaking, not fear. The release of something held so long the body has forgotten it is still holding it. A pressure built up behind the ribs, then left. The specific, unbearable lightness of putting down a thing you have been carrying. For so long it stopped feeling like weight and started feeling like just the shape of you. She pressed her palms flat on her knees and breathed, and underneath the relief and the grief and the shaking hands, she let herself name the other thing too. The warm, certain, specific thing connected to a man who had walked the full length of a table in silence and covered her arm with both hands, and then turned around and burned down the room on her behalf. She was not going to call it love yet. She was going to call it trust, because she understood the value of trust precisely. And trust was the accurate word for what she felt right now, sitting in his coat in the firelight. She reached up. She began to unbutton the remaining glove. She set it on the chair by the window. She did not reach for another. 4 months later, in November, on a morning when the ash trees along the North Lane had gone bare, and the light came in thin and clear through the library windows, Audra sat at her father's old desk. Hawkins had arranged to have it brought from Carlwick when the estate was returned, and completed the first volume of a medical reference compiled from Dr. Malcolm Sterne's 19 years of records. Reed was reading at the desk across from her. He had taken to spending his mornings in the library in the past 6 weeks. He did not always speak. He did not need to. He looked up when she set down her pen. "Finished?" he asked. "Volume 1, she said. "There are 2 more. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of open. The one he had stopped trying to manage around her, in the slow, particular way of a man who has kept things controlled for a long time, and is only now finding out what that cost him. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the desk and took her hand, and she let him, and they stayed like that in the thin November light without speaking, the quiet between them the best kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. 2 years after that, the second volume was bound. The third came in the spring, dark red leather, dedicated in the front matter to Dr. Malcolm Sterne of Carlwick, who believed that an accurate record was a form of justice. Audra had a daughter by then, 17 months old, with her father's unhurried way of assessing a room and her mother's composure. A son was due in the autumn. On an evening in May, with the library fire going and the curtains pulled against the cool dark outside, their daughter asleep on a folded blanket near the hearth with one small shoe off and the other still on, Audra looked across the room at her husband. He looked up from his book. He smiled. Not the almost smile she had filed away in October and kept carefully. A real one, easy and warm, the kind that had taken months to arrive and then simply stayed. She had come to Dunmere Hall in July, in white gloves buttoned to the elbow in the July heat, with nothing but her father's journal sewn into the lining of her travelling bag, and the specific patience of a woman who had learned that the only real advantage available to her was the long view. She had been told in a variety of ways by a variety of people that she was without standing, without recourse, a country physician's daughter made useful by circumstances and nothing more. She had never quite believed it. She had just needed the room that would prove her right.